The greatest is always last. Remember the primacy recency effect, you know? The last paper of this conference and the greatest is my friend and colleague, Peter Hansen. Another lawyer. You're going to be burdened with law today, whether you like it or not. Mr. Hansen is an investment law specialist with his own practice in Washington, D.C. He holds a JD and an MBA in International Economic Policy from American University and an LLM from Cambridge University. And I met Peter, well, the two of us were studying. We were 2 of 6 American students studying in a group of 140 students at Cambridge for the Master of Laws program. And Peter and I were in a couple of different courses together, and we pioneered at Cambridge. You know, the Americans are pretty brash. We come in there and we shake up the Brits. And so we argued Slade's case, which was originally decided in 1603 before a panel of 5 faculty judges. They'd never had that happen in the school before, and probably never again after we did it. But Peter is the author of seminal articles on World Bank employment law, as well as scholarly and occasional pieces on African investment issues. He does a lot of work in investment in Africa. From 1999 to 2002, Peter was editor-in-chief of International Legal Materials at the American Society of International Law. He's an active lecturer on African and other topics, and was for many years adjunct professor of international law at the American University School of International Service. My good friend Peter Hansen will speak on a positivist legal framework for confronting genocide. Peter.
Thank you. This is the end of the conference, so I can say, I guess, in line with Shakespeare, we few, we hearty few, we band of brothers and sisters, we are here. We've made it. We've made it to the end. I hope you've all had a good lunch and ready for a good snooze. There'll be a bit of Latin. You can relax a bit. And on this very cheery topic of confronting genocide. So, and yes, so, yes. And in fact, the positivist, for those of you not really into legal nerddom, is basically the declared law. Is there a declared legal framework for confronting genocide as opposed to generalized norms? That would be a normative legal framework. So being a positivist myself, I will argue on that side, which I can already tell the sleep is grabbing you already. I can see something. Okay, well, one of the benefits of being the last main speaker basically is that you get to sum up and enjoy all of the various points that were made during the conference. It's been absolutely fascinating for those of you who've been through it all. I will say, I won't sum up everybody else's points. I will say that during a panel talk where I was on it near the beginning, there was a question of, what are the factors involved in this whole situation? I put forward 3, which I kind of presaged my talk here today, and I'll bring up again. That is the morality issue, what should be done. There's the prudence issue, what can be done, and then there's the knowledge issue, which is, well, what do we know is going on? I will simply point out that my talk, unlike the others, is a post-Holocaust look. This is after the Holocaust has happened, after everyone's cleaned up and looked at it and figured out what to do. What is to be done, in the words of Lenin, basically what is to be done about future genocides, and how do you stop that? And we have to face that now with the Yazidis in Iraq and Syria, for example, with Mount Sinjar. We saw it with Rwanda, we see it with Srebrenica. There was the anniversary just today being discussed on the British news. Just a couple points, and this may go, I'll try to keep it relatively brief so we have a lot of Q&A, which would be great. I just want to point out that also, given a lot of the talks that have been given, there are things to keep in mind. On the morality side, there's the moral imperative, what must be done, and then there's moral preening, and you'll see that in the law that we have to discuss today. For prudence, there's really what can be done, what are we able to do, like with bombing Auschwitz, for example, what could really have prudently been done. On the other hand, there's the excuse. What How do we get out of doing stuff? And that's also, being from Washington, I can assure you that's the number one topic of consideration at all times. As for knowledge, there's what do you know and what do you want to assume? For good or ill, is something happening? Is something not happening? Do you want to cast a blind eye? Do you want to look for things that aren't there? So to summarize, I will not have a PowerPoint, by the way, so you'll just have to remember the Latin and the UN steps as we go. But essentially, the basic idea is that the lessons of the Holocaust were not learned at all in the international legal framework following the Holocaust. We'll get into why in a bit of detail. As for that, now, the rules that were created after the Holocaust and after the founding of the UN do, however, allow, I think, under a relatively classical reading, a method of justifying military intervention by individual states to confront genocide. So, ready, guys? The history of the Genocide Convention. Breathe if necessary, stretch. I will accept, watch. If you want to do yoga, it's your business. Okay, the history of the Genocide Convention in a nutshell. Okay, so in the pre-war period that we've been discussing, and then the World War II era we've been discussing, genocide did not exist. Genocide had never happened in a legal sense, never happened. There was no word. Genocide did not exist as a word. There were massacres, there were killings, there was a persecution, there was oppression, but there was no such thing as genocide, period. Full stop, never heard of it. It's a combination of two words, people and killing. First is Greek, genos, and the second is Latin, fides, or what have you. It's a neologism, and it was created in the year 1944 at the height of the Holocaust. It was obviously, it found its moment, tragically enough, but it was not actually based on the Holocaust. It had been generated or developed by the Armenian events, which we now call the Armenian Genocide, or most people do. And it was created, the word was coined in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin, a Galician Jew who had escaped the Holocaust and who had for many years been very interested in the Armenian genocide, what he called the Armenian Genocide, and put the name to it. Now, the reason you didn't have such a thing as genocide, I mean, you had killings, you had ethnic cleansings, you had all sorts, I mean, you had Genghis Khan in the past. It's not like people hadn't been killed. But under the law, it was just not really contemplated under classical international law. The reason being, and I believe Mr. Tanke pointed out, was Westphalia. It might have been Mr. Groth, I'm sorry. Point out the Westphalian system. Now, at the end of the 30 Years' War in the 1600s, I understand this is going way back, but at the end of the 30 Years' Religious Wars, when a third of the population of Germany had been killed and laid waste to, etc., the way for the Protestants and the Catholics and their supporting states to put an end to this was the Peace of Westphalia. And this is the basis of all international law today, which is that the state is an independent legal entity, like a natural person. It's a legal person. The person is sovereign as to the internal affairs. So that state is just floating like an entity. And they have perfect freedom to act within their borders. In fact, the basis of Westphalian sovereignty at the time was Quios regio eius religio, I think. It's basically, he who has the kingdom determines the religion. So that's why you have Catholic states and Lutheran states, etc. That's all part of the birth of international law. So the idea was they could decide how their nationals worshipped, etc. So it probably just never crossed anyone's mind. If you wanted to exterminate a part of your nationals, go ahead. I mean, that's an internal thing. We don't bother with that. If you're doing it, if you want to kill people, that's your business. We don't care. And that's the way it is today. We don't invade North Korea because they mistreat their people. When Kim Il-sung says, we must kill down to the third generation, all those against the regime, no one's invading. So we really, to this day, don't care. I say this as a cold-blooded international lawyer. And we as the world do not care, because that's their business. We're not going to go in. Cruel, but that's life. And so now, genocide, because of this, because you can kill your own nationals, the question is, when do you deal with genocide? And the answer is, if there's a war on. So if you have a war and there's an invasion, and they start massacring people, this will begin to sound very familiar, then you can say there's a problem here, that you are massacring foreign civilians. So to bring it to the Holocaust situation, if Hitler had reserved his ire towards the Jews to Germany, and he had publicly slaughtered, not just quietly or putting them on a train to somewhere, but actively slaughtered them in the streets, Kristallnacht style, that'd be it, no problem. Why? Because under international law, that was an internal matter. What mattered was if he goes into Poland and starts killing Poles, Polish Jews. That's a problem, because essentially genocide is an adjunct to the laws of war. It is a breach of chivalry. If you go in and beat your opponent, that's fine. But if you beat your opponent, the person says, mercy, okay, I'm done, and then you go and kill them and their wives and their kids, okay, that's going way too far. So essentially you're dealing with medieval chivalry, gussied up into the 20th century. Are you guys happy yet? I mean, this is a talk about genocide, guys, so please, don't, it's grim, but that's how it is. And this is what we deal with today in many respects. Like I said, there are many regimes that kill people in their own areas. This was an issue, for example, with Rwanda. Rwanda didn't invade and kill Burundians, they killed internally. So, oh well, there wasn't that much of a problem until it got too bad and you had to do something. So, what happened was at Nuremberg, after it began to come out that there were these massacres, etc., well, you have to do something. We have to get these, Nazis somehow. So, what happened was they had this new word that this guy Lemkin has come up with. It's called genocide. Oh, that's fascinating, fascinating. What do we do with that? I don't know. Let's go get us some Nazis. They're evil. Okay, so they have to cobble together something. Again, killing German Jews is not a problem. Killing Polish Jews, Hungarian Jews, that was more of an issue. Because again, the Germans violated the laws of war. So that's why you have, for example, crimes against humanity. That was the watchword of the Nuremberg tribunals. Crimes against humanity. What does that mean? Well, it's pretty much what I've just told you. They mentioned genocide, but they acknowledged its existence, but at that point it was a cool new concept. Cool new concept. That's, wow, genocide, that's neat. But effectively. But otherwise, it was crimes against humanity. So now we have a gap here. After World War II, after Nuremberg, people begin to say, genocide is really not good at any time. I know we have these kind of mafia rules. You do your own thing and no one cares in your own borders. But peacetime genocide. If you want to, go and massacre people en masse, etc., in peacetime, that's also a problem. Now, strangely enough, under international law, this is a kind of a revolutionary idea. Because sovereignty says, you're sovereign. No one comes into your yard. That's it. So if you want to kill your people, you kill your people. So the idea that you can now reach in to that yard and go into that person's yard and say, stop killing your own people, blows their mind. So this has to actually become a legal issue. So, perhaps a bit ironically, Cuba, and then with India and Panama, approached the new organization, the United Nations, and seek to ban genocide in peacetime as well as in war. Bit of a shocker. So now the General Assembly obviously is sympathetic because we are talking about massacres, etc. They condemn genocide, this new concept, whatever it is, this name, this word, And they said it was of international concern. Great. So they referred to their Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, which called it a crime. Okay, it's a crime. Now, is it a legislated crime? No. It's just a kind of a sense of the legislature, essentially speaking. It's not a law, it's just deemed a crime. So they send it down to the Secretary General, where the actual work will get done. And they said to the Secretary General of the United Nations, brand new, it's 1946, 47 at this point, we want to ban genocide. Can you figure out a treaty to do that? So the Secretary General does actually a pretty fantastic job. And obviously it's one of the pressing moments of the day. So he taps Lemkin, the original expert who came up with the word, and he has two others, Donadieu de Vabre and Pella, Italian, and they start putting together the first draft convention to ban genocide. So, in an extreme nutshell, Secretary General produces this wonderful report with commentary. It goes to the member states, they get comments, it goes back, and then ECOSOC creates another committee, an ad hoc committee, puts it together. They create a report. It then goes to the sixth committee, which are the lawyers, essentially, the experts in law. And then it goes up to the General Assembly once everything's been hashed through and every bit. And it was unanimously adopted on December 9th, 1948, and it entered into force on January 12th, 1951, when a sufficient number of state ratifications had come in. And what's interesting, by the way, there's a big debate over whether you could denounce the treaty, and the treaty has a term limit, which would technically make genocide legal after 5 years or whatever if everyone denounced it, in theory. That was the practice at the time. But obviously it never has been, thankfully. So now let's have some fun as lawyers and, never wanted to be lawyers. Okay, what is genocide? You have a concept. And everyone, I bet every single person here has a very different view of what genocide means. I think if you asked, if I'm going to be controversial, I'll say if you look at what President Putin thinks would be genocide with respect to the Ukrainians and what he would accuse them of, I suspect we'd have a very different conception of what he would say is genocide. Now, one thing was agreed, and that was that genocide would henceforward be separated from crimes against humanity. It was different. It was not just wartime. It was the killing of a people at any time, anywhere, anyhow. But now the question is, which people are we talking about? Because with law, you have to say who's in and who's out. Nowadays, for example, at the time, the Nazis had killed homosexuals. Nowadays, with the rise of gay rights, do they constitute a people that you can kill or not kill or what have you? Do they have protection under this? So if you do it by race and religion alone, theoretically under international law, you could kill all the gays in your country. Now, we of course find that abhorrent. But this, again, law has to deal with what's written. So the Secretary General came up with a very good idea, again, working with Lemkin and the others, that human groups, any human group with distinctive characteristics would be protected. Okay, great. Now, there's a big debate over race, religion, etc., and eventually the Swedes came up with some wacko word called ethnical, not ethnic, ethnical, which is supposed to be like a sub-national group that's kind of interesting, like a linguistic group, like Basque speakers in France. So that's one way. Now, for our purposes, one of the interesting bits is political groups. Are political groups protected from mass liquidation? The U.S. supported this idea that yes, political groups would be spared, would be saved, would be protected, theoretically. The Soviet Union did not think so. And as with most things with the period and with the convention, you have a lot of issues of Cold War politics and fighting over ideologies and et cetera. Now, one of the very interesting bits, it's just a side note, and maybe I'm making too much of it, but the Secretary General in his comments wrote that, look, even if we protect political groups, the Nazis would not be protected. No. They caused the genocide. and the fascists caused the genocide. They will not be protected. Now, if, as a lawyer, scumbag lawyer that I am, cold-hearted, reptilian guy that I am, if I want to, you say, okay, what's the flip side? What's the logic? And that means you can liquidate Nazis. Yes. I mean, if you want to, if you said every member of the Nazi party during wartime is subject to the death penalty, well, technically, under a Secretary General's reign, you could say that. Why not? You could wipe them out en masse, as long as they're tried and found to be part of that group. Grim, but that's what lawyers do. So now, are we all following this, by the way? Are we having fun? No? Okay. Okay. Now, what constitutes, now we know who's protected, but what is protected? Like, what does it mean to be genocidally attacked? I mean, as a lawyer, you have to do that, you know? What is and what isn't? So there's a lot of debate. And cultural genocide was one of them, one of the aspects. And it was eventually voted down because it was too problematic. One reason being, how do you assimilate people? If you have a nation of immigrants like the U.S. and you want to have people take English classes and et cetera, or the French laïcité policy of lay society, you don't want overt religious aspects, that was voted down as too problematic. So again, from a legal perspective, if in the Jewish situation, for example, if groups came in and burned Torah scrolls, that's not genocide. It's a human rights violation, but that is a distinct area of law. Genocide, they decided, could fall into, you could spread it out to infinity. So you had to narrow it. What are we talking about here? And what the lawyers came up with, well, it's physical genocide, a la the Holocaust, and then there's biological genocide, preventing births. So if you said, okay, we'll leave, for example, all the Jews in the territory alive, but we're going to sterilize them. That's genocide because they cannot have physical children. Now, oddly enough, I mean, theoretically, you could remove all aspects of Jewish life, but that would not be genocide. It would be a human rights violation. So it's a physical killing of people on the ground. So another aspect, ethnic cleansing, what we've seen in Bosnia and such, in the idea of expelling people from their homes is not genocide. Again, it's a human rights violation, but it is not genocide. So when you often hear it conflated nowadays, because Bosnia is more in our mind, and you hear about displaced persons, it's not genocide. If you push everyone out of a territory, it is what it is. I mean, it's a human rights violation, there are issues, etc., but it is not genocide under the law. Even today, it's been admitted, even today, it's not been outlawed in that respect. It's been said even in the UN that, in the Secretary General's document, that does not constitute an international crime to do expulsions, but it can include other crimes. War is not genocide. If you have high civilian casualties, if you firebomb Dresden, it's not genocide. You may be killing civilians en masse. As long as you're not targeting them for the specific purpose of wiping them out, it's not genocide. It's wartime, it's crimes against humanity, you should have not had an oops, what have you, but it is not genocide. The notion behind it, as the Secretary General pointed out, was if you have a war, the beaten, once you beat them, in a Clausewitzian sense, once you break their will to fight and they give up, they have a right to life. I mean, they may not like it, it may not be good, but they have a right to life. If once you've broken their will, they submit, and then you start massacring, that's when you get into genocide. So, who can commit genocide? We've said about who's protected, what are they protected from. Who can commit genocide? I mean, in a legal sense, so you can say, that person. Like if a little kid's running around, at a genocidal, pogrom thing, he's like yelling and carrying on, and he's 5 years old. Is he a genocidaire? Is he a genocide committer? Not really. I mean, but the general notion is that there are individual genocidaires, that people like a la Rwanda can go out and kill their neighbor with the intent of killing, like if you kill that Tutsi, you're doing it because they're a Tutsi. It's like a hate. So That's an individual can commit genocidal acts. Parties, for example, like the Nazi Party, the early Nazi Party, can commit genocidal acts because they're individuals. Once you get into the state, the officials, the hierarchy, who is involved, then yes, officials can definitely be implicated in the genocide. And in fact, there's a vibrant debate about whether the state is always complicit, no matter what. If there's a private genocide that occurs, is the state complicit? And that's an issue. The state itself, by the way, is not complicit, is never complicit, is never guilty of genocide. So if, for example, like Germany, if someone wanted to sue Germany for the Holocaust, under the Genocide Convention, it could not be done. Under the Genocide Convention. Mr. Tanke has brought up, I think, very interesting ways, certainly worth exploring, of looking at reparations, etc. But states themselves are never criminally liable because the state is just territory with a population and a government. That's all it is. So if you were to hold the state accountable, that means that every infant, every severely mentally retarded adult would be criminally liable. And that just doesn't fly in international law. And if you were to bring the state to the International Court of Justice, and there was discussion of what do you do, they point out, well, you can order them to stop, and they would have to pay reparations for their genocidal actions. So theoretically, if you brought Germany into the ICJ at some point, you could sue them and they would pay reparations, but not to their citizens. Going back to what I said, the traditional sovereign concept is that if Germany had liquidated just its Jews, but not the Polish Jews, you would not owe them anything because they're yours. But if you killed the Polish Jews, Poland could sue Germany and be paid reparations for the damage done to the Polish Jews. Incidentally, and again, international law is cold, you would pay Poland for the damage done to the Jews. There would be no duty for Poland to pay the Jewish victims or their families. Because again, you have dishonored the state of Poland. You have not, it's not a personal right. I didn't say it was fun. I didn't say it was good. It's a grim situation. So, the limits of the Genocide Convention, I think, are already somewhat clear. But it gets actually much more so, and this is why I said the lessons have not been learned after the Holocaust. The Holocaust, why didn't we bomb Auschwitz? Why didn't people do something? Why, et cetera, et cetera. The entire focus of the criminal the convention is that it's criminal prosecution. It's basically a permanent Nuremberg concept. So you'll define what genocide is, who's protected from what, etc. But when it comes to doing something, it's criminal prosecution. That's it. That is it. The UK representative at the time opined, and it's rather true, that it's an obvious truth, he said, that individuals can be tried for murder. So technically any genocidaire could be tried for murder in any country. Murder is illegal. But a state could never be punished except through war. And that's, in legal terms, it's more or less a truism. Because the state doesn't actually exist. It's a legal person. You would have to firebomb a city or something to impose damage. So now, then the question is, well, where are you going to try these people? All right, well, you've done Nuremberg. Nuremberg's done. So what is it? Well, the French were very, very logical, as always, and very thoughtful. And they said, well, we need to have an international tribunal. Because really, the state is always complicit, no matter what. If they're helpless, then they can't try them anyway. And if they aren't helpless, they're complicit. So we need an international tribunal, especially for heads of state, heads of government. This was knocked down, until 2002. Now we have the International Criminal Court, and we've hauled mostly African leaders there. But the idea was between 48, when it was adopted in 2002, there was no international tribunal even for that. So that means if you committed genocide and you were the head of state or any official If you wanted to wipe out the gypsies, for example, in your village area or whatever, there is nothing under international law to protect anyone or to punish, except for the duty to have the national court in that state try you, and essentially for murder. Now, there is a problem, as we all know, from the Nazis who fled down to Argentina and such, is that if you're in Argentina and you're arrested, well, Argentina isn't where they had the Holocaust, and they're not necessarily nationals of Argentina. They're aliens. So what do? Have they made it? Fortunately, no. That's one good thing. The notion is that if you can extradite, if Germany, for example, or Poland wanted to extradite a Nazi war criminal to Poland, for example, to try them for genocide, that could be done if that's the territorial aspect. But more likely it would be you'd send them to Germany for trial because they're a national of Germany, this, say, Waffen-SS type. So you'd send them to Germany to be tried for genocide. Now, if you didn't, or if it was impossible because of national laws, you have, all right, here's your chance if your eyes are just about to shut. Here's where you go, because I'm about to use Latin. Okay, it's aut punire, which is either surrender the person or punish them. In other words, if you can't give them up, you can't extradite them, you have to try them and punish them. So in this case, if Argentina could not send, for whatever reason, the Waffen-SS guy to Germany, he would have to be tried and potentially punished in Argentina. So this all seems a bit, it's not a particularly great system. I mean, it's kind of like devolved Nuremberg, right? You can just, just handle it in your own courts. It's not very good. So as to military action, let's say, now, again, we've talked over and over in this conference about why didn't somebody do something when something was going on, when it was about to happen or after it happened or what have you. In other words, what we are really talking about here is military action. Why couldn't we send a plane in, special forces, like right now on Mount Sinjar? If let's just say there's no Security Council, anything going on, et cetera, it was just up to, say, the U.S. had a couple bombers and some special forces guy in the area. Couldn't we save the people on Mount Sinjar, the Yazidis? Not under the Genocide Convention. The Genocide Convention, you have to understand, was born with the United Nations. Everyone's thinking it's a brave new world. We're tired of this war. It's all going to be handled by these 5 superpowers or what have you, and some other people, and they will handle it. So the Security Council was expected to act if you're having a genocide, presumably, you'd have the Security Council acting, right? Well, as we all know, the Security Council bogged down in Cold War politics, etc. What's the genocide anyway? If it helped your people, you'd go after it. If not, you wouldn't. We all know that now. But you couldn't, I'm sure people understood that at the time. I mean, they weren't idiots. But they couldn't say anything. Because if you said we will allow individual states to intervene in a genocide, when we've just created this whole new architecture, and we've got this awesome secretariat going up, et cetera, brave new world, we're tired of 30 million dead, whatever, it would be politically impossible. So they gave it to the Security Council. But they said, you don't have to refer genocide to the Security Council. We expect you would as a matter of course, but you do not have to give it to the Security Council. And what's indicated is that they knew what the situation was because some people said, no, you shouldn't have to refer it to the Security Council. Is that because they didn't want genocide handled? No. They said you should be allowed to go to the General Assembly, to the ECOSOC, even to the Trusteeship Council for basically colonial genocides, because there's no veto there. In other words, no one can stop it. We at least can go somewhere and get the UN to authorize something. So they knew. Now, individual state action was never considered. It's clear. It was not in anyone's mind that you would just go barreling down in there, America is going to go in and, take care of this problem. Not considered in the convention. And there was a lot of fear that if you had a head of state or a head of government who was committing genocide openly, outrageously, they would not be turned over by the state doing it, obviously. If you're running the state, they're not going to cut you out and you're a genocidal maniac. They're not going to, unless they overthrow you, they're not going to turn you over. And in fact, the UK representative, he was a wise person, he said, well, forcible arrest in that situation is even less conceivable than that person being turned over. So in other words, we're not going to be able to go in and get them. That would require essentially a police force, meaning an army, able to overcome the sovereign armies of that state, commanded to protect the genocidal maniac running it. So that's not going to happen. That's not even conceivable. The Venezuelan representative said something that's kind of depressing but very indicative. He said, well, governments, and especially bad governments, fall. And that when they're overthrown, in other words, internally, then the succeeding government will bring them to justice. So in other words, if you're a genocidal maniac and you're running country X, no one will do anything about it. If the Security Council doesn't do anything, when that person dies or whatever, or gets sick and gets overthrown, their own courts will put them on trial. Does that sound very satisfying? I think mopping up the blood is a very poor excuse, very poor substitute. So this is the law as it is today. This is why Rwanda can occur readily. And this is why Srebrenica, or talk about the Khmer Rouge, or, you name it, Mount Sinjar. That's why it happens over and over and over. Because the law as it is when you can, if you're authorized, get them and put them in front of the local courts for murder. That's the law as it is. So, not satisfied with this, you have some idealist chaps and gals out there who think, no. Let's have a normative-based legal system. Like, forget this is the positive law, this is the declared law, the adopted law. Forget that. Let's apply Latin. Let's apply Latin. What's called jus cogens. Oh, it's a peremptory norm. If two states create a treaty to kill their whatever minority at the time, that's a void treaty. That can't be right. That's against moral law. Okay, well, here's the thing. The two states running it, that treaty, might abide by that treaty perfectly. They don't care if anyone else thinks it's illegal. And calling it jus cogens doesn't mean anything. Now, if there are a lot of, I won't go into the legal reasons, but essentially it's quite obvious to everybody in the legal field in this area that universally it's believed genocide as defined is illegal. That's what we call opinio juris, opinion of law. It is the psychological element of custom. It's not just habitual action, but you're thinking that's the law. You don't kill populations. But that's no different than jus cogens. It's basically, it doesn't make it any more or any stronger. Most importantly, nothing. Even if you said this norm was peremptory, you must act, beating a shoe on something, doesn't mean anything. Because again, you have the convention, and the convention does not authorize any action. And if the Security Council vetoes it or doesn't care, avoids it, you might be able to go to the General Assembly, and if they don't really do anything, well, that's it. There's no imperative to do anything. So, it makes the law an ass, quite frankly, because there are a lot of international lawyers who say, it's jus cogens, matter of course, we're very pious about it, and when something like Rwanda happens, or they may yell and carry on, but there's no law. There's no real law. There's morality, some thoughts, nice notions, but it's not a law. And the states know this. So now they've come up since 2001 with another concept, which is good within its limits, called responsibility to protect, or R2P. It's very chic, R2P. And R2P is a good idea in itself. I mean, but it's kind of jumping the gun. Because you have this idea of humanitarian intervention. We will intervene to, well, what they say, we don't call it intervention, we call it protection. Okay, fine. You call it that. And basically it's the idea that if you have a Rwanda or you have a Bosnia where people are being ethnically cleansed and pushed out of their homes or mass starvation or what have you, other states can go into that other state's yard and take care of these people. That's great. It's interesting. It's certainly interesting. But again, it's not law. So you're always, always, always at the mercy of international opinion based on law. And the law, which we'll talk about briefly, well, I'll get into it in a moment when I give my own thesis, and then I'll wrap up. The basic idea is the R2P people say, well, the Security Council should act. And if not, the General Assembly should act. And if they don't act, well, then you might get these ad hoc coalitions like we've seen, or we may even have individual hot-dogging countries, and they're suspect. Always suspect. If an individual state goes in, there's something else going on. It comes out. They're quite frank about it. Because this notion of the collective will do it. Now, if the collective doesn't do it, well, then here's the thing. If you're a state and across the border is a genocide and the Security Council won't act, and you say, we will act, we will do what we need to do, you're automatically suspect under international law. You're doing what you shouldn't be doing. Maybe you have good motives, but you shouldn't really be doing it. It's part of the prejudice of the UN order. It's one of the gaps. So, here's the thing. Confronting someone hissing at me? No, I'm just, I hear, okay. I thought someone was like maybe hissing, like, boo, Hansen. So, okay. I hadn't even gotten to my thesis, so, which is fortunately part 4 of 4. You're almost done. Okay, confronting genocide militarily, right? This is a no-no to talk about. And being an American, as you can hear, the idea of unilateral American action is not exactly always a welcome thing in the international sphere. Fine, I accept that. But obviously we see that the anti-genocide regime after World War II is basically a setup for a World War II Holocaust regime. Well, when the blood stops flowing, we'll get the mops out. That's the model. So if you don't accept that, what do? I mean, we do have individual states going in. So how do you justify this? Because remember, R2P even is just an idea, just a notion. Well, we could do that. We should do that. Yes, right. That's not law. So I'm just going to suggest something. If a state is, in my nerdy field, this is controversial, so excuse me if I hem and haw for a moment. But essentially, if an individual state wants to go in to stop a genocide, there's got to be a legal basis for it. So I'm going to propose one. Now, I'm going to make a very quick thought, just a hypothetical, just so I make my terms clear. Let's assume that you have a genocide that's about to begin, right? Now, this is not preparation in terms of, we're going to get a group together in 3 weeks and have a march. This is not a maybe, this is not a maybe. I would even argue it's not an isolated incident. You could do it on that. But this is where you have a serious Mount Sinjar level genocide happening. You have large flight of people. You have executions. You have beheadings. You know what's about to happen. And you can document it. This is not a Gulf of Tonkin excuse type situation. This is serious. And it's going to go into operation. It may not be as relatively smooth as the Nazis did. I mean, they were kind of a haphazard operation, quite frankly, even them. But, if you want to have a serious thing. So and you can prove it as much as you can. Now, let's assume also that the Security Council does not act or can't act in time. General Assembly doesn't really get its act together. Let's just say in this limited situation that nothing's going to happen in any way, and let's just say 10,000 people will be killed. Even of 1 million, 1% will be killed. Small amount. Do you wait? Morality says no. Legally, maybe you should. I don't know. But let's just say you have a hot-dogging leader of the country who says, no, that will not stand. I will not sacrifice one child to these génocidaires. Now, let's also assume that the state in question is able to act. It's not just yelling from the sidelines, but can act. Okay, so here's the basic problem. You face UN Charter, Article 2.4. And that's the big one, all right, which is essentially you cannot, one state, remember, this is the classic Westphalian system, embed in the UN Charter the basics. And that is you cannot violate the territorial integrity of a state. One state can't get in the zone of the other, can't get in the other one's yard. You cannot threaten or assault their political independence. Okay? And you cannot violate the purposes of the UN, of which the most important is keeping the peace, the Westphalian system, where all states do look at each other. Okay. So now let's just say you send a few bombers, a couple, helicopter gunships in with special forces that'll rappel down and shoot the daylights out of any private persons who are trying to kill X village. So they aren't even necessarily part of the army, just a bunch of rampaging mob. So will you send a helicopter gunship across the border to shoot up those people? Arrest their leaders, try them, and hang them. Let's be honest. I mean, the idea, of course, the death penalty is, would you send a Nazi to a gas chamber to execute him? Poetic justice, perhaps, but obviously opinions will differ on that. But let's just say, let's put it to its max. You're going to try whoever's leading that mob, bring them back, hang them. That's what you're going to do if the local state won't do it. Is this possible? Well, let's just say, I'm going to put forward an argument whether or not people accepted that it is. Territorial integrity. Obviously, if the state is functioning, it's not, you will violate their territorial integrity, potentially. I mean, but what if you have a failed state? What if you have Somalia, right? What if you have a genocide of some local group somewhere out in the bush in Somalia? It's not really a state. I mean, I guess it is now. I mean, they have small government, but they're not in effective control of the whole of Somalia, and everyone knows it. And I know nothing against Somalia, but it is what it is under the law. Do they have, quote unquote, territorial integrity? Not really. It's a convenient fiction so that people don't annex it. And you might breach your own territorial boundaries, but maybe not, especially if you were to attack, say, from the ocean. So here's the thing. Can you violate their territorial integrity? I would say, well, let's assume it's a failed state. I would say yes, because here's the thing. Territorial integrity in that situation of a failed state is a legal fiction. So we don't annex the state, so it doesn't become terra nullius, no man's land. You cannot have a genocide, an actual convention-level genocide going on, and let the blood be spilled based on a fiction. I would argue that in this event, you would not breach the UN Charter by going in. Let's assume it's not a failed state. Okay, let's assume you go right over the territorial integrity of an actual functioning country. Then you're really getting more into the political independence area. They have a right, things are going on. You're getting in our yard, pal. That's an issue, right? Okay. Well, again, if it's a failed state, they're not really, they have self-determination rights, but they're not really politically doing anything. They're dead. They're a failed state. So you wouldn't annex them, but the right to self-determination does not incorporate a right to commit genocide. So if you need to go in, I would argue that, in fact, you could go in without violating the UN Charter, because you're dealing, again, with a failed state, and it does not have a right to determine its destiny by killing a group of people. As for a regular state, let's assume Nazi Germany Part 2, right? You'll be going in and telling them in their yard they cannot kill people. And if no one else will do it, you'll do it, high noon style. You'll go in. Well, if the state is functioning, obviously they should have the right to suppress the genocide themselves. And they should do that, obviously. And I think jumping the gun and not allowing them to suppress it themselves would be pretextual. I give that. But let's assume that they don't do anything or they don't care. Then, it's just some provincial gypsies being wiped out. These things happen. We got bigger problems. Well, that would be a much tougher case. But depending on the prudence of it, the scale of it, etc., as a legal matter, the state is complicit. It's not allowed to commit an international crime, and genocide is a crime. If the state government is committing the crime and complicit in it, they have no right to, that is where their sovereignty ends, according to the UN. So in that case, intervention could very well be allowed. And the government, of course, could always be replaced once you've tried and hung the perpetrators. Even reconstitute the government if necessary, a la Nazi Germany. So one thing I would like to point out, of course, for the legal nerds online, my fellow legal nerds, is that you cannot dissolve a state. You cannot annex a state. You cannot colonize a state, even under the pretext of genocide. You can't say these people are hopeless. They become our colony. We'll teach them right from wrong. You can't do that. You have to do the minimum that's proportional to end the genocide. That might require some occupation, if necessary, but you cannot make the state your own as a result. Just got to put that caveat in. So now finally, you cannot violate the purposes of the UN. And the classic purpose of the UN is to maintain the peace. Now, of course, the way to think about this is not morality, it's the Corleone family. Have you guys seen The Godfather? The Godfather. Hey, we keep the peace. We're going to keep the peace. Shh, shh. You do your thing in your own town. Okay. You want to keep the peace. That's Article 2.4. It is not moral, it's prudential, just like the mafia. So, peace is the purpose. You don't want trouble. But the peace cannot exist. It cannot be a genocidal peace, and it cannot be a criminal peace. You cannot allow a state to be a criminal under UN declared law and expect to have the peace kept. So I would say that if you intervened, again, there'd have to be a lot of caveats, which we don't have time to get into, but you would have, I think there would be a very strong, solid argument that intervention to suppress a genocide militarily, even by an individual state, would be perfectly okay if the state doing it were complicit in the genocide. So, just to close out here, the implications of activist doctrine, this activist doctrine I put forward, there were these set of ideas. One, and I don't think I'm speaking personally to President Putin, but I have a feeling he and his intellectual buddies would disagree with me. One, you have to follow the convention standards. You have to look and have your lawyers say, what is it? What actually is genocide? What is it specifically? And you cannot go overboard and make up your own definitions. You have to be proportional to dealing with this stuff. For example, let's put it in the Holocaust situation. If you knew that Auschwitz was there, and you said, well, we could bomb that, or we could bomb Munich and just annihilate it. Tit for tat. Well, of course, Auschwitz will keep going, fine, but we'll get Munich. That's not proportional. You had to have, no matter how bad the Germans were, you're kind of not doing what you need to do. Bomb Auschwitz. Let Munich handle itself for now. So you have to be proportional. You also have to be willing to turn it over to the Security Council. You cannot go rogue completely. This is not a get out of law free. You have to follow the Security Council. Now, what does it mean to intervene when you actually go in? We've seen it in Iraq. We're starting to see it in Syria. We've seen it in Rwanda. I would summarize it very quickly in saying you have to reestablish order. You have maybe official, maybe unofficial groups, whether you have Einsatzgruppen or you have private mobs in there. You have to reestablish order. Put them down. Stop them. Kill them if necessary. Now, you have to put those who you catch, you have to put on trial. What you do with them after that, well, let's face it, they're genocidal guys. So if you hang them, well, I mean, they got only what they were looking to do to children. and that you should relentlessly pursue the génocidaire. You may have to try and make sure, like a bureaucrat somewhere doing social security checks and a member of the party is not necessarily a génocidaire. But Heinrich Himmler, well, you get the idea. Now, one of the more controversial points is, if you're in battlefield conditions, let's just say you're dealing with ISIS right now, and you're in Syria, and you see most of these guys are not uniformed soldiers. What can you do? Well, let's look at it this way. That entire apparatus of ISIS is out there to kill Yazidis, Christians, whatever. Essentially Yazidis, I think they were trying to exterminate straight out, not put them under the jizya tax like the Christians. So that whole group is out in the field trying to kill every man, woman, and child out there. So I would suggest that in that situation, in that battlefield situation where there is no order, you can target their civilians. Not their women and children and non-combatants, not their hospitals, but their press agencies, their leaders abroad, their headquarters. Civilians, fine, they're all military targets. Because again, in my view at least, they're out there in the field trying to organize the slaughter of children in a battlefield condition. That's a no-no under any standard. Obviously, I want to wrap this up, so I'll just say, what do you do with difficulties like, is the toll of the local population greater than the people you're trying to save? Do you have to kill 50,000 to save 10? Okay, that's a moral question, quite an issue. Hopefully it would never come to that. But one of the interesting aspects of genocide is that the loss of a people, the Jews, whomever, the Yazidis, the Roma, is in itself a crime. A loss so complete that just the loss of that people would outweigh on the margins. And then what about mutual genocide? What if you have two groups that just want to slaughter each other wholesale until the last one is left? That, very difficult question. You'd have to pacify the situation and figure out a political some kind of solution. So there you go. Anyway, that's some ideas on this. I see one smile. Thank you. Thank you very much. I know it's grim, but there you go. So thank you.
We have a little bit of time if there are any questions. Yes, you, sir, if you could please identify yourself and limit it to a question.
Yeah.
Oh.
Jeff Dobby. I was wondering whether you could comment on the concept of incitement to genocide, where, if at all, does it fall within this rubric of confronting genocide?
That's a great.
If I could cite one example, the radio broadcasts in Rwanda that preceded the massacres, they were, I understand, clear, cut, vitriolic calls for violence, and so if you could comment on that.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, Mr. Dobe, and you apologize for giving an example. I mean, we have had people, like at any conference, who get up and decide this is their viva voce oral exam for their doctoral thesis. So thank you. That was a very brief question. Incitement is a fascinating question. The original folks putting together the convention had to deal with this, and they eventually said that preparatory acts would be excluded as a crime. That you can prepare for genocide, at least to the moment of doing it, but that it was not in itself criminal. And I'll give a bit of background. The basic notion is that the communist bloc was arguing that incitement was criminal because you could print truth in the papers but not untruth. And of course that truth was whatever the Communist Party said. The West saw this as a gambit to try to limit free speech. And in fact, the U.S. Was completely overt about that this would be used as a pretext to shut down all speech, and because it would be eventually genocidal. So fortunately at that point, the West prevailed. Now that doesn't mean that when you have a Radio Mille Collines situation like in Rwanda where they're, let's go get the Tutsis, et cetera. I mean, at that point, I'd be sitting in front of the Secretary General and Security Council and raising Cain at that point. And if they don't do anything and no one notices, because let's face it, it's Rwanda at the time, then I would maybe start getting some fighter jets ready or something, hopefully trying to stop, again, because you're dealing with 800,000 people slaughtered. So I would start boning up for whatever you need to do at that point. But you can't intervene just because someone puts a poster up or even makes an incendiary speech. So I hope does that answer your question? Cool, nice.
Yes, you, sir.
Hello? Well, crikey, statistics. Oh, dear. I can't say exactly. I mean, there have been the ICTY for Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. There's been the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Those have led to some very extensive trials, which are fascinating for international lawyers, but don't necessarily get justice done. The International Criminal Court, which is much more recent, has tried, I can't remember, not that many cases essentially. And I'm not touching on issues like with Belgium with universal jurisdiction where they try to try officials in their courts. That's a whole issue I won't get into for your sakes as well as mine. But there haven't been that many cases, and in fact in Rwanda there were the Gacaca courts where they basically herded all these Hutu accused into these huts, and they've pretty much sat there for years. I don't know what their status is now. The last I heard they were sitting there awaiting trial, but at some point in those cases having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is sometimes almost just the only proper option left. If they had done this after the Holocaust, for example, we might have gotten a far more detailed account of what the Germans were actually doing. I can say, a person I'm honored to call my friend, Ben Ferencz, he's now the last living Nuremberg prosecutor. He's, I think, 95. He came to speak to my class one time, and he said, well, in the early days, I would drive into a village and have all the guys show up in the town hall, and he'd give them pencil and paper and tell them, each of you is going to write down what happened here, and if I find you're lying, I'll be shot. And he got what he needed to. He got the information. Sometimes maybe a mechanism like that would have been at least better for historians as to how to plan to combat the next genocide. Does that help? Oh, absolutely, it does create case law. But one thing to remember, international law, like most civil law courts, the international legal system is based on Roman law, and then which is now French law, German law, that sort of thing. Case law does not have binding precedent. It's not like the U.S. with stare decisis, but it is persuasive, and there is a lot of doctrinal work. So, do you see?
Okay, we can maybe take one more question. You, sir, in the blue.
A failed state is not illegal. To begin with, it's not legal. No one declares it, thou art failed. You botched it. Forget it. We're officially taking your nameplate. No one does that. But in that case, it's a very difficult question. It's essentially a civil war situation, which brings up a whole other area of law, et cetera. So that's an issue. I think when you're talking about Iraq and Syria, for all intents and purposes, in the area of at least around Mount Sinjar, one might ask, could either state, or has either state mounted an effective assault on ISIS in that area? I mean, the Kurds have been doing that, thank God, but they're not technically a state. So, really, if you want to recognize Kurdistan in that situation, there would be legal grounds, I suppose. But yeah. So, what was the other part of the question? Oh, with the gas. If you gas, that would be a violation of the laws of war, but it wouldn't be genocide unless they said we're going to wipe out the Yazidis. It would be the act of wiping them out, not the method.
Okay, thank you. We will take a brief break and resume at 3 o'clock for our next panel.
Thank you very much.